She sat on the hotel steps whispering, "I'm hungry," and the millionaire CEO's life changed forever. The rain fell in a soft, steady drizzle, coating the streets in a thin glimmer as the city lights reflected off the wet pavement. Cars hissed as they passed, umbrellas bobbed up and down on the crowded sidewalks, and the grand hotel loomed with its marble steps shining slick with water. On those steps, curled into herself against the cold, sat a little girl who looked far too fragile for such a place. Her thin arms hugged her knees tightly to her chest, the denim jacket she wore doing little to shield her from the chill that seeped into her bones. Her red dress was damp at the hem, her brown hair tangled and clinging to her face, and her bare feet shifted uneasily against the wet stone. She looked around not with fear but with a hollow patience, as if waiting for someone who might never come. When her lips moved, the sound was almost swallowed by the noise of the city, a faint whisper that carried more weight than any cry for help, "I'm hungry." Just then, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb, the kind that drew second glances even in a city where wealth was commonplace. The driver hurried around to open the door, and out stepped a man who seemed to command attention without even trying. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his light blue suit immaculately tailored, his dark hair neatly combed back, and his piercing blue eyes scanning the entrance before fixing suddenly on the small figure seated on the steps. For a moment he thought he was mistaken. Surely no child would be left sitting outside in the rain, alone, at this hour, but the reality of it stopped him cold. Jonathan Hale, CEO of a major airline and a man whose name appeared in newspapers almost daily, was not used to being caught off guard. He lived in a world of schedules, meetings, and negotiations, where everything had a purpose and nothing was left to chance. Yet here was something that defied all of that, a child no older than 5, drenched, shivering, and completely overlooked by the dozens of people bustling in and out of the hotel. He hesitated only for a second before walking toward her, his polished shoes clicking softly against the stone. The girl lifted her head when she sensed him near, and their eyes met. Hers were startlingly blue, deep and clear, and though her face was pale and tired, there was no fear in her expression. Instead, there was a weary acceptance, as though she had already seen too much for someone so small. Jonathan found himself stopping a step short, his heart tightening in a way he hadn't felt in years. He had built his life on control and power, yet in that moment, confronted by a child's simple suffering, he felt utterly powerless. He opened his mouth to ask something, who she was, why she was here, where her parents might be, but before he could speak, she whispered again, her voice low but steady. "I'm hungry." The words pierced him more than any accusation could have. He was a man surrounded by abundance, who could walk into the hotel at any moment and order a meal worth more than this child might have seen in her entire short life. Yet none of his money or status meant anything in the face of this simple truth. A little girl was sitting outside in the rain with no one to care for her, and she was hungry. For reasons he could not explain, Jonathan crouched down so that he was eye level with her, the rain dampening his suit without him even noticing. He studied her fragile frame, the way her small hands trembled, and he felt a surge of something that surprised him. It was not pity, but something fiercer, an unwillingness to walk away, a refusal to let this moment pass as though it meant nothing. "Come with me," he said quietly, extending his hand. His voice, which in boardrooms could command silence and obedience, now held only gentleness. The girl hesitated, her wide eyes studying him as though she wasn't sure if he was real, but then she slowly placed her tiny hand in his. It was cold to the touch, so small and delicate in his palm, and he closed his fingers around it with a silent vow he didn't yet understand. As he led her inside, past the glittering chandeliers and warm air of the hotel lobby, he knew only one thing with absolute certainty: his life, so carefully measured and controlled until now, had just changed forever. Inside the hotel, the warmth was almost overwhelming compared to the damp chill outside. The lobby glowed with golden light from chandeliers and wall sconces, the marble floors polished to a mirror-like sheen, and the air carried the faint aroma of expensive perfumes mixed with fresh flowers from ornate vases. People moved about in elegant clothes, their laughter echoing softly, but for Jonathan it all seemed to blur as he focused on the tiny figure at his side. The little girl clung to his hand, her steps hesitant, her eyes wide as they darted from one glittering surface to another. It was as if she had stepped into a world she had only ever imagined, a place so far removed from the cold steps outside that it might as well have been another universe. Jonathan led her toward the hotel's restaurant, his mind racing in ways it never did even during the most critical negotiations. Questions tumbled over each other. Who was this child? Where were her parents? What circumstances could possibly leave her alone on a rainy night? He had faced ruthless businessmen, government officials, and international crises with calm precision, yet now he felt a strange unease, a weight he could not shake. He glanced down at her, noticing how her hair stuck in damp strands to her cheeks and how she hugged herself as though she didn't quite believe she was safe yet. Something about the fragile defiance in her posture made his chest tighten. The maitre d' gave Jonathan a startled glance as he entered with the child, clearly unsure how to respond, but one sharp nod from the CEO was enough to silence any questions. They were shown to a quiet corner booth, away from the curious eyes of the other guests. Jonathan gestured for her to sit, and she climbed into the chair awkwardly, her small frame almost swallowed by the plush seat. She looked around nervously, as though expecting someone to stop her at any moment and send her back out into the cold. Jonathan noticed the way she bit her lip and kept her hands folded tightly together on her lap, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch anything. When the waiter approached, Jonathan ordered without even glancing at the menu, listing off warm soup, fresh bread, roasted chicken, and a selection of fruit, along with milk and juice. The girl's eyes widened at the sound of the words, and she looked up at him, as if unable to believe such things could really be for her. "It's all right," he told her softly. "Eat as much as you like." His voice carried none of the cold authority that his colleagues knew so well, it was softer, warmer, and it surprised even him. When the food arrived, the girl hesitated at first, staring at the steaming bowl of soup and the basket of bread rolls as though they might vanish if she moved too quickly. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, then paused, her eyes flicking to Jonathan's face for permission. He gave her a small nod, and only then did she lift the spoon, bringing the soup to her lips with careful movements. The first taste seemed to break something inside her. She began to eat with more urgency, though still cautiously, like someone who had learned that meals were rare gifts never to be wasted. Jonathan watched silently, his throat tight. He had presided over business deals worth billions, but he could not remember ever feeling as helpless, or as moved, as he did while watching a little girl eat as if it were the most important moment of her life. Between bites, she looked up at him again, and he noticed that her eyes had softened slightly, though a shadow of wariness remained. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She swallowed, her small voice barely carrying across the table. "Emily." The sound of it struck him with unexpected force. It was a simple name, but saying it out loud gave her presence a weight, an identity, that made her seem less like a lost child and more like someone who belonged in his world, even if only for that evening. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying her as she continued to eat, and for the first time in many years, his thoughts strayed away from schedules, deadlines, and financial forecasts. He wondered where Emily had come from, what pain she had already endured, and why fate had placed her in his path. He felt an unfamiliar stirring, something between responsibility and protectiveness, a sense that he could not simply return her to the cold once this meal was done. As she reached for a piece of bread with her tiny hand, he realized that he was already making a decision, one that had nothing to do with logic or strategy. He could not let her disappear back into the shadows of the city. He could not walk away. The clinking of glasses and the murmur of voices filled the restaurant, but Jonathan heard none of it. His entire world had narrowed to the small figure across from him, eating slowly yet determinedly, as if reclaiming some small piece of strength with every bite. He understood in that moment that this encounter was not random, that his life, built on order and control, had just taken a turn he never expected. And though he did not yet know where it would lead, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he could never be the same man he had been before seeing Emily on those hotel steps. Jonathan barely slept that night, his thoughts circling endlessly around the image of Emily sitting small and fragile on the cold marble steps, her voice echoing in his mind with that haunting simplicity, "I'm hungry." He was a man used to solving problems through strategy and influence, but this was different. There was no boardroom negotiation that could explain why a 5-year-old girl had been left to fend for herself in the rain. By morning, his determination was set. He would find out who she was, what had happened to her family, and how such a child could end up abandoned outside a luxury hotel. When Emily woke in the guest room he had arranged for her, she looked around with the wide, uncertain eyes of someone who had never slept on a mattress so soft or beneath sheets that smelled faintly of lavender. She seemed almost afraid to disturb the space, perching on the edge of the bed with her small feet dangling above the carpet. When he appeared in the doorway, she flinched slightly, but then offered him a tentative smile that both broke his heart and strengthened his resolve. He asked if she had slept well, and she nodded, though her expression told him the comfort of the night had felt almost unreal to her, like something borrowed rather than truly hers. Over breakfast in the quiet dining room, Jonathan gently tried to draw her out. The room was filled with the clink of silverware and the scent of warm pastries, but Emily sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, only reaching for food when he encouraged her. Bit by bit, pieces of her story emerged in hesitant words. Her mother had died when Emily was still very small. Her father had been in and out of her life, and the last she remembered of him was a blur of anger and disappearance. After that, she had lived with her grandmother, who had been her only constant. She spoke of her grandmother with a soft fondness, recalling little things like how she used to hum lullabies while cooking or how she always saved the ripest apple for Emily. But her grandmother had fallen ill, and then one day she simply didn't wake up. Jonathan listened, his jaw tightening as Emily explained how she had tried to stay in the apartment alone, how neighbors had sometimes given her scraps, but eventually she had been told to leave. She had wandered from place to place, keeping to crowded areas where she thought it might be safer, until finally she ended up at the hotel, drawn by the lights and the sound of people, hoping someone might notice her. She said it all with a calmness that disturbed him deeply, as though she had already accepted that being left behind was the only way her life could unfold. The more she spoke, the more Jonathan felt a mixture of anger and sorrow rising inside him. He thought of all the people who must have walked past her, of the systems that were supposed to protect children but had clearly failed her, and of the cruel randomness that allowed someone like him to live in unimaginable abundance while a little girl starved on a street corner. He wanted to tell her she was safe now, that she would never have to go through such things again, but the words caught in his throat. Promises were not something he made lightly, and this promise would change both of their lives forever. After breakfast he called one of his assistants and instructed her to discreetly gather information on Emily's background. Within hours, he had confirmation of what Emily had told him. There was no father actively in the picture, no relatives who could take her in, no legal guardian left. The recommendation from the authorities was swift and chilling: she should be placed into the foster system immediately. As Jonathan read the report, he felt his stomach twist. He had visited orphanages before for charity events, seen the rows of children dressed neatly for photographs, but he also remembered the hollow eyes of those who knew they were waiting for someone who might never come. The thought of Emily, with her quiet resilience and her fragile smile, being swallowed into that system filled him with an outrage he hadn't felt in years. That evening, as Emily sat cross-legged on the floor of his study, carefully drawing with the colored pencils one of his staff had brought her, Jonathan stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. He thought of the life he had built, one of control and success, but also one marked by solitude. His wealth had insulated him from many things, but it had also left his world strangely empty. Now, with Emily humming softly to herself on his carpet, that emptiness seemed unbearable. He turned back to her, watching the way she concentrated on her drawing, her small hand steady despite all she had endured, and he made a silent decision that startled even him. He would not let her go. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt that his life was no longer entirely his own. It belonged now, in some profound way, to the little girl who had looked up at him on the hotel steps and whispered that she was hungry. And though he didn't know how he would fight the bureaucracy, the doubts, or the judgments that were sure to come, he knew with absolute certainty that Emily would not face her battles alone ever again. Jonathan had spent his entire career mastering the art of persuasion, but as he sat across from the woman from Child Services in his office the following morning, he realized this battle would be unlike any he had fought before. The woman's tone was clipped, her words rehearsed, and though she maintained an air of professionalism, Jonathan could sense the detachment behind her polite smile. She had a folder in front of her filled with neatly typed reports, references to statutes, and recommendations from the department, and as she spoke she repeated the same refrain: Emily could not remain with him, not without months of vetting, background checks, and a lengthy approval process. For now, she said firmly, Emily would have to be placed in foster care. Jonathan listened in silence, his hands steepled under his chin, though every muscle in his body was tight with resistance. The idea of Emily being handed off to strangers, shuffled from one temporary household to another, was unbearable. He imagined her small face falling into that expression of quiet acceptance, the same one she had worn when she sat on the steps of the hotel, and the thought nearly broke him. When the woman finished speaking, Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers with the unyielding focus that had unsettled more than one boardroom adversary. He did not raise his voice, but the steel in it was unmistakable. That little girl is not going anywhere. Not today, not tomorrow. She has a home now. The woman stiffened, clearly taken aback, and began to explain the consequences of obstructing the system, but Jonathan cut her off with a calm that was more dangerous than anger. He explained that he would use every legal channel available to fight their decision, that he had the resources to hire the best attorneys in the state, and that he would not rest until Emily's future was secured. He had faced government regulators, hostile takeovers, and international crises, and he would bring the same relentless energy to this fight. The social worker faltered, realizing she was no longer speaking to just another concerned citizen but to a man whose influence reached far beyond the walls of his office. Still, she insisted the law was the law. When she left, Jonathan felt the weight of what he had just committed to settle heavily on his shoulders. This was not a business deal he could negotiate his way out of overnight. It would be a drawn-out struggle, one where his wealth and power might help but could not shield him entirely from scrutiny. He walked through the quiet halls of his house that evening and found Emily curled up on the sofa in the library, fast asleep with a book still open on her lap. Her small body rose and fell with each shallow breath, her head resting against the arm of the chair as though she were afraid to stretch out fully, as if ready to be moved at any moment. Jonathan felt something shift inside him as he carefully lifted the book from her lap and draped a blanket over her shoulders. That night he stood in front of the large mirror in his bedroom, staring at his reflection. He was a man who had built an empire from nothing, whose face appeared on magazine covers, whose name carried weight in circles most people could only dream of. And yet here he was, shaken to his core by a child who had walked into his life by sheer chance. Or perhaps, he thought, not chance at all. He could not explain why, but it felt as if everything he had done until now, all the wealth, all the influence, was preparing him for this one fight, the fight for Emily. In the days that followed, Jonathan began the process of securing lawyers and gathering evidence. His assistants whispered nervously in hallways, his board members exchanged worried glances, and the media had already begun to pick up rumors of the story. Questions circulated. Why would a man like Jonathan Hale, who had never married or raised children, suddenly fight so fiercely for a girl who was not his blood? Some called it reckless, others saw it as scandal, but Jonathan ignored them all. Each morning, when Emily came timidly into his office with a drawing she had made for him or simply to sit quietly at his side while he worked, he knew he could not waver. One evening, as they shared dinner together at the long mahogany table in the dining room, Emily put down her fork and looked at him with an expression that was far too serious for her years. "Will they take me away?" she asked softly, her voice trembling just enough to reveal the fear she had been carrying in silence. Jonathan froze, his knife and fork still in his hands, and then set them down slowly. He reached across the table, covering her small hand with his much larger one, and met her eyes with a steadiness that came not from certainty but from resolve. "No," he said firmly, though he knew the battle was far from over. "Not if I can help it. You belong here now." Emily studied him for a long moment, as if testing whether she could believe the words. At last she nodded, her eyes softening as a faint smile touched her lips. She picked up her fork again and continued eating, though her shoulders seemed lighter, her posture less tense. Jonathan sat back in his chair, watching her with a swell of emotion that surprised him. He had faced countless opponents in his life, but for the first time he felt that he was fighting not just for himself or his company but for something infinitely more important. For a child who had whispered to him that she was hungry. For a chance to give her the life she deserved. For the possibility that saving her might also, in some way, save him. The following weeks unfolded with a kind of relentless intensity that Jonathan had not experienced since the earliest days of building his company, but this was a different kind of battle, one that could not be measured in profits or market shares. Each morning began with calls from his legal team, long discussions about custody petitions, guardianship papers, and the labyrinth of child welfare laws that seemed designed more to delay than to protect. He sat through hours of briefings, combing through every possible precedent, preparing for hearings that promised to be contentious. Yet even as his days were consumed by this fight, his evenings told a different story, one that centered around the small girl who had become the heart of his world. Emily quickly began to fill his home with life in ways Jonathan hadn't realized he'd been craving for years. She padded across the marble floors barefoot, her laughter echoing off the high ceilings, turning the once silent mansion into something that resembled a home. She would sit cross-legged on the floor of his study with a box of crayons, coloring intently while Jonathan handled contracts and emails, occasionally glancing up to show him her newest creation. Sometimes she would appear at his side in the kitchen while the chef prepared dinner, earnestly asking if she could stir a pot or arrange the plates, and the staff, initially bewildered, soon found themselves charmed by her eagerness. She began to greet them all by name, a habit that seemed to soften even the most stoic faces. Still, beneath these tender moments, Jonathan felt the tension pressing in from outside. His board of directors had called an emergency meeting, not about company performance, but about him. They questioned his judgment, his priorities, and the headlines that were beginning to circulate. Why would the CEO of one of the largest airlines in the country involve himself in such a scandal? One director demanded. "Do you realize the damage this could cause to our reputation?" Jonathan listened with an expression of detached calm, though inside he felt a simmering fury. He told them plainly that the company would continue to thrive because he had built it to withstand much more than gossip, and if they doubted his ability to lead because he chose to protect a child, then perhaps they had underestimated the very man who had led them to success. His voice carried such finality that no one dared push further, though he knew the whispers would not stop. That night, after the exhausting confrontation, Jonathan returned home late to find Emily asleep in the library again. She had insisted on staying awake until he came back, but exhaustion had claimed her, and she had curled up on the couch with one of her drawings clutched in her hand. He knelt beside her, carefully easing the paper from her fingers, and saw that it was a child's sketch of two figures holding hands, a tall man in a blue suit and a small girl in a red dress. Above them she had drawn a house, with windows full of light. Jonathan sat there for a long time, staring at the crude but heartfelt lines, realizing that to her, he was already home. The following weekend, Jonathan made a decision that surprised even himself. He took Emily on a drive out of the city, away from the glass towers and boardrooms, into the countryside where the air smelled of earth and pine. He showed her a small estate he owned but rarely visited, a place with sprawling fields, a lake that glistened in the sun, and horses grazing nearby. Emily's face lit up as she ran through the tall grass, her laughter carried on the breeze, and Jonathan followed at a slower pace, watching her with a sense of wonder. It was in that moment that he realized he was no longer thinking of her as a temporary presence or a responsibility to be managed. She was his family, as surely as if she had been born to him. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, they sat together on the porch, Emily clutching a glass of milk while Jonathan sipped a rare glass of whiskey. She leaned against his arm, her head heavy with sleep, and asked in a drowsy whisper, "Will you always be here?" The question struck him with such force that he felt his throat tighten, but he answered without hesitation, his voice low but firm. "Yes, Emily. Always." Later, when he carried her to bed and tucked her beneath the covers, Jonathan lingered in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the soft light of the room. He thought of the battles still ahead, the hearings, the scrutiny, the judgment, but none of it frightened him anymore. For the first time in years, he felt as though he had something worth fighting for that was not tied to ambition or wealth. He felt the beginnings of a purpose larger than himself, one that had crept quietly into his life on a rainy night when a little girl whispered that she was hungry. And now, he thought, nothing and no one would ever take that away. The first hearing came faster than Jonathan expected, and though his lawyers had tried to prepare him for every scenario, he found that nothing could have truly braced him for the cold, clinical atmosphere of the courtroom when the case was called. The room was stark, with its pale walls, its polished wood benches, and the faint echo of voices bouncing off the high ceiling. At the front sat the judge, her expression unreadable, while across the aisle the representatives from Child Services arranged their files in neat stacks. They looked at Jonathan not with hostility but with the weary detachment of people who believed they were only doing their jobs, and perhaps that was what unsettled him most. To them, Emily was another case, another child to be processed through a system, not the living, breathing little girl who had fallen asleep against his shoulder the night before. Jonathan sat at the table with his attorneys, but his attention was fixed on Emily, who had been brought into the room by a caseworker. She wore a simple dress he had chosen for her that morning, her hair brushed carefully, but the way she clutched the small stuffed rabbit he had given her betrayed her nervousness. Her wide blue eyes scanned the room, full of uncertainty, and then they found his. For a moment the noise and the procedures faded away, and there was only the silent exchange between them, her fear, his steady reassurance. He nodded slightly, letting her know she was not alone, and saw her shoulders relax just a fraction. The opening arguments began with the Child Services representative outlining their position in a tone so dispassionate it bordered on cruel. They spoke of procedure, of the risks of placing a child in the custody of someone without prior parenting experience, of the importance of stability that only licensed foster homes could provide. They never once spoke Emily's name, only referred to her as the child, a phrase that made Jonathan's stomach twist each time it was repeated. To them she was paperwork, a responsibility to be managed, but to him she was a person, a little girl who had lived through loss and abandonment and who had finally found a reason to believe she could belong again. When it was Jonathan's turn, he stood and let his lawyers step aside. He did not read from prepared notes or rely on legal jargon. Instead, he spoke plainly, his voice steady, his gaze never leaving the judge. He told the story of the night he found Emily on the hotel steps, her voice barely audible as she said she was hungry. He described how she had been failed by every safety net that should have protected her, how she had shown a resilience far beyond her years, and how in the short time she had been with him she had transformed his silent house into a home filled with warmth. He admitted openly that he was not perfect, that he had no experience raising children, but he declared with unflinching conviction that he had the resources, the determination, and above all, the love to give Emily the life she deserved. The room was silent when he finished, the weight of his words hanging in the air. For a moment he saw the judge's expression soften, though she quickly masked it with professional neutrality. Emily, who had been listening with rapt attention, clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter and whispered something so quietly that only the caseworker beside her could hear. But Jonathan noticed the way her lips moved, and he knew what she had said. She had whispered, "He's my dad." The hearing continued with more legal arguments, testimony from social workers, and questions about Jonathan's capacity to provide a stable environment. His lawyers presented evidence of his financial stability, his spotless record, and even character references from longtime employees who spoke about his integrity and fairness. Still, Jonathan felt the cold machinery of the system pressing against him, threatening to reduce everything he felt into columns of data and bureaucratic rules. Yet every time his resolve wavered, he looked at Emily and remembered the promise he had made to her at the dinner table: she belonged here, with him, and he would not let her down. When the session adjourned for the day, the outcome remained uncertain, but Jonathan walked out of the courtroom with his head high, Emily's small hand gripping his tightly. Outside, reporters swarmed, shouting questions, cameras flashing, but Jonathan shielded her with his body, ignoring the noise. All that mattered was the way she looked up at him, her eyes filled with trust. In that moment he realized something profound. This battle was no longer about convincing a judge or silencing critics. It was about proving to Emily, day after day, that he meant what he said, that he would stand between her and the world no matter how hard the fight became. And as he lifted her into the car and felt her small arms wrap around his neck, he knew that no system, no law, no headline would ever be enough to shake that vow. The weeks following the first hearing were some of the most grueling Jonathan had ever experienced, and yet they were also some of the most transformative. Every day seemed like a balancing act between the relentless demands of his company and the all-consuming fight to keep Emily by his side. His office turned into a war room of sorts, stacks of legal documents piled high, lawyers coming and going with updates and strategies, and his phone buzzing constantly with questions from the board. Yet no matter how chaotic the days became, Jonathan always made sure to return home in time for Emily's bedtime. It was not negotiable. He could delegate contracts worth millions, but he would not delegate the responsibility of tucking her in, listening to her stories, and reminding her that she was safe. Emily, though still so young, seemed to sense the storm that surrounded them. She asked fewer questions now, no longer voicing the fear that she might be taken away, but Jonathan could see it in the way she clung to him at unexpected moments. Sometimes she would wander into his office late at night, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and quietly curl up in the armchair across from his desk, as though just being near him was enough to keep the nightmares away. Other times, she would slip her hand into his as they walked through the house, holding on silently, her wide blue eyes searching his face for reassurance. And every time, Jonathan would squeeze her hand back, wordlessly telling her that he wasn't going anywhere. Meanwhile, the media frenzy grew louder. Headlines speculated on his motives, some painting him as a hero, others accusing him of staging the entire story for publicity. Talk shows debated whether a man like him, a bachelor CEO with no parenting experience, had any business raising a child. Social media exploded with opinions, and while some defended him, many were cruel. Jonathan, who had long been accustomed to public scrutiny, found himself infuriated not for his own reputation but for Emily's. She was being reduced to a symbol, a talking point, when she was, above all else, just a little girl who wanted a home. He ordered his legal team to pursue privacy protections, determined to shield her from the worst of the attention, but he knew that curiosity could never be completely silenced. The second hearing was even more intense than the first. This time, Child Services brought in witnesses who argued that Jonathan's lifestyle was too demanding, that he could not possibly provide the constant attention a child needed. They highlighted his travel schedule, the size of his company, and even suggested that his wealth might isolate Emily rather than nurture her. Jonathan listened with a calm exterior, though inside he burned with anger at the insinuation that love could be measured by timesheets or bank accounts. When it was his turn to speak, he did not argue about wealth or schedules. Instead, he spoke of nights spent reading Emily stories, of mornings when she ran into his study with a drawing just for him, of how she had laughed for the first time in weeks when they visited the countryside estate. He spoke not as a CEO defending his capacity but as a man who had found something worth more than every dollar he had ever earned. Perhaps the most powerful moment of the hearing came when Emily herself was asked a question. The judge, gentle in her tone, asked if she liked living with Mr. Hale. Emily shifted nervously, clutching her stuffed rabbit, and for a moment Jonathan feared she would freeze. But then she lifted her chin, her voice small but steady, and said, "He's my family." The courtroom went utterly silent, and Jonathan felt his chest tighten with pride and sorrow all at once. He knew those words had not been rehearsed, they were the pure, unvarnished truth of a child who had finally found someone to hold on to. Outside the courthouse, Jonathan carried Emily through the sea of cameras, shielding her face as best he could. She buried her head against his shoulder, and he whispered to her that she had been brave, that she had done perfectly. That evening, when he tucked her into bed, she asked softly, "Did I do the right thing?" Jonathan knelt by her side, smoothing the hair back from her forehead, and told her that she had done more than the right thing, she had told the truth, and the truth was always enough. As he sat in his study later that night, alone with his thoughts, Jonathan realized how profoundly his life had changed. The battles were not over, and the final decision had yet to be made, but he no longer doubted where his path led. The man who had once defined himself by his company, his fortune, and his power now defined himself by a promise whispered in the quiet moments of the night, that Emily would never again sit alone in the cold, waiting for someone who might never come. That promise had already reshaped him, and he knew he would carry it for the rest of his life. The final hearing arrived on a gray morning, the kind of day when the clouds pressed low and heavy as though the sky itself was holding its breath. Jonathan walked into the courthouse with Emily's hand in his, her tiny fingers wrapped tightly around his, and for once he felt something he had not felt in years, vulnerability. He had walked into countless rooms where the stakes were astronomical, where fortunes and futures were decided, but none of those moments compared to this one. Today was not about balance sheets or corporate empires. Today was about whether the little girl at his side would walk out with him as family or be handed over to a system that had already failed her once. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The lawyers shuffled their papers, the child services representatives whispered among themselves, and the judge presided with her usual calm detachment. Jonathan sat tall, his expression resolute, though his pulse thundered in his ears. Emily sat beside him, her stuffed rabbit tucked protectively in her lap, her wide eyes scanning the room. He could feel her fear in the way she leaned against his arm, but he also felt her trust, and that trust gave him strength. The proceedings began with closing statements. The representatives from Child Services argued once again that Jonathan's life was too demanding, that his position as CEO would prevent him from giving Emily the attention and stability she needed. They pointed out that parenting required more than financial means, that it required time, patience, and selflessness, qualities they doubted he could provide. Their words were polished, professional, and relentless, but Jonathan barely heard them. His gaze was fixed on the judge, waiting for his moment, ready to speak from a place that no legal argument could touch. When it was finally his turn, Jonathan rose to his feet and stepped forward. He did not carry notes, and his lawyers had not scripted his words. Instead, He spoke with the raw honesty of a man who had nothing left to prove except the truth of his heart. He told the court that Emily was not a burden but a gift, that she had given him more than he could ever give her. He spoke of the nights when she had cried herself to sleep and how he had promised she would never be alone again, of the mornings when her laughter filled his home with light, and of the simple but profound fact that in her eyes he had already become a father. He admitted that he had not planned for this, that he had never imagined himself raising a child, but he declared that sometimes life placed in your hands the very thing you never knew you needed. Then he looked directly at the judge, his voice unwavering. I am not asking for leniency. I am not asking for exceptions. I am asking for the chance to keep my promise to a little girl who has already suffered more than any child should. I have the means to give her a safe home, the patience to guide her, and the love to stand by her every day of her life. She is not the child in a file. She is Emily. She is my daughter in every way that matters. The silence that followed was profound. Even the shuffle of papers and the coughs of spectators seemed to fade into nothing. Jonathan glanced at Emily, and to his surprise she was no longer clutching her rabbit but had reached out and taken his hand again, her small fingers squeezing his with a certainty that melted the last of his fear. He knew in that moment that no matter what the court decided, he had already become what she needed most. The judge's decision came after a long pause, her voice calm but carrying a gravity that made every ear in the room strain to hear. She acknowledged the concerns raised by child services, but she also acknowledged the testimony, the evidence, and most importantly, the truth she had witnessed in that courtroom. She noted Emily's own words, her insistence that Jonathan was her family, and she said quietly but firmly that she could not ignore the bond before her. The ruling was clear: Jonathan Hale was granted guardianship of Emily, with the path open for full adoption. The breath Jonathan had been holding for weeks finally released in a rush, his shoulders sagging with relief. Emily gasped softly, her eyes wide, and then she threw her arms around him with a force that nearly knocked him off balance. She buried her face in his chest, whispering, "I told you they wouldn't take me away." His arms closed around her, and for the first time in his life he felt something richer than victory, something deeper than success. It was belonging. Outside the courthouse, the cameras flashed and the questions flew, but Jonathan didn't care. He lifted Emily into his arms, shielding her from the chaos, and when she whispered in his ear, "Can we go home now?" he smiled for the first time in days, a real smile, one that came from somewhere deep inside. "Yes," he said simply. "Let's go home." That evening, the house felt different. It was not just a mansion filled with expensive things but a home filled with promise. Emily ran through the halls, her laughter echoing against the high ceilings, and Jonathan followed at a slower pace, his chest warm with pride. He stood in the doorway of her room as she arranged her stuffed rabbit on the pillow, then looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Good night, Dad," she whispered. The word stopped him cold, filling him with a kind of joy he had never known. He bent down, kissed her forehead, and whispered back, "Good night, sweetheart." As he turned off the light and closed the door, Jonathan realized that the life he had built, a life of power, wealth, and control, had been incomplete until now. He had fought battles across boardrooms and continents, but this was the only one that truly mattered, and he had won. Not for himself, but for the little girl who had once sat hungry on the steps of a hotel and whispered three simple words that had changed everything: "I'm hungry." Now, she would never be hungry for food, for safety, or for love again. She was home, and so was he.